The Philistines have long been remembered as the enemies of the Israelites, with their name often carrying a stigma that still lingers in our modern lexicon. To this day, the word Philistine is used as a label for someone considered uncultured, brutish, or lacking intellectual refinement. Yet, this image, shaped by millennia of cultural narratives, does not reflect the full complexity of the people who once inhabited the cities of the ancient Mediterranean world. The Philistines were not merely the antagonists in the biblical tales of David and Goliath, their legacy is a far richer and more enigmatic one. They were a people caught between myth and history, their identity shaped by migration, war, and survival. The question that arises, then, is not simply who the Philistines were, but why have they been remembered in this way? Were they truly as barbaric and foreign as they have often been portrayed, or were they misunderstood? To unravel this mystery is to reconsider the entire narrative of their civilization, one that has often been overshadowed by stories of conflict and conquest. When we think of the Philistines, we might picture an endless stretch of sand, ancient ruins lying beneath the blazing sun, and the ruins of cities that once stood as emblems of power in their time. Yet, for all that we associate with their civilization, very little of the Philistine story has been fully understood. While much of what we know comes from outside accounts, from Egyptian texts, the Hebrew Bible, and the observations of Greek and Roman historians, these sources often view the Philistines through a lens of animosity or fear. These ancient writings are filled with references to the Philistines as uncivilized invaders, a disruptive force from the sea, bent on threatening the established order. But such descriptions were written by those who saw themselves in direct opposition to the Philistines, framing them in a way that diminished their complexity as a people. The tale of the Philistines begins long before the Bible's portrayal of Goliath and David. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Philistines were part of the broader movements of people during the collapse of the Bronze Age, a time of upheaval and migration across the Mediterranean. They did not appear out of nowhere, rather, they were part of a larger wave of migration, a phenomenon that shaped the ancient world in ways that we are only beginning to understand. The collapse of the Great Bronze Age civilizations, like those of the Mycenaeans and the Hittites, led to the scattering of peoples across the Mediterranean. Many of these displaced populations sought new territories to call home, and among them were the ancestors of the Philistines. The biblical account of the Philistines' arrival in Canaan tells of a people coming from the sea, and this image has long shaped the popular understanding of their origins. But the reality is far more complex. Recent archaeological discoveries suggest that the Philistines' migration was not a singular event or an invasion, but part of a larger, long-term movement of peoples from the Aegean region, driven by the collapse of civilizations and the resulting instability. These peoples, often referred to as the Sea Peoples in ancient Egyptian records, were not a single group but a collection of different ethnicities and cultures. The Philistines were one of these groups, and they settled in the southern coastal regions of Canaan, establishing a series of city-states that would become some of the most powerful centers in the ancient world. Yet, even as we look at these early settlements, it becomes clear that the Philistines were not merely outsiders. They did not simply impose their culture on the Canaanites, rather, they interacted with and absorbed aspects of the cultures around them. The cities they founded, Ashkelon, Gaza, and Ekron, were not just military strongholds, they were complex urban centers, where trade, craft, and industry thrived. They left behind a rich material culture, with distinctive pottery, weapons, and artifacts that show the Philistines were more than just warriors. They were skilled craftsmen, traders, and farmers, people who adapted to their environment in ways that allowed them to flourish in a world that was rapidly changing. The image of the Philistines as mindless invaders or crude warriors does not hold up when we examine their society more closely. The Philistines were not just a military force, they were a people in the process of defining themselves, navigating the complicated realities of migration, settlement, and survival. Their cities were full of life, their pottery adorned with intricate designs that reflected their interactions with the wider Mediterranean world. They were influenced by the cultures of their neighbors, the Egyptians, the Canaanites, the Mycenaeans, and they in turn influenced those around them. This was a people in transition, reshaping their identity as they encountered new environments and new peoples. But it is not just their material culture that defies the simple narratives about the Philistines. The very way they were remembered in ancient times is a testament to their importance in the region. The Bible, with its recurring references to the Philistines, reflects the intense and often contentious relationship between the Philistines and their neighbors. Yet, despite the Bible's portrayal of them as enemies of the Israelites, there is evidence to suggest that the Philistines were not always seen as outsiders or invaders. In fact, some biblical scholars argue that the Philistines may have been more akin to the Israelites in terms of their societal structure, religion, and cultural practices than we have traditionally been led to believe. While there were certainly conflicts, the relationship between the two peoples was not as black and white as the biblical narrative might suggest. In fact, the Philistines, like many ancient peoples, were defined not only by their actions but by the way their neighbors and adversaries portrayed them. The biblical account, which often depicted the Philistines as a brutish and warlike people, tells us more about the Israelites' own self-perception than it does about the Philistines themselves. The Philistines were the other, the foil against which the Israelites could define themselves. This dynamic of opposition, of defining oneself through contrast, was not unique to the Israelites and the Philistines, but is a theme that recurs throughout history. The Philistines became, in many ways, a mirror for their enemies, and their identity was shaped as much by these reflections as by their own actions and culture. In this sense, the Philistines are not merely a footnote in history but a pivotal part of the ancient Mediterranean world. Their legacy is not just a story of conflict but of survival, adaptation, and cultural exchange. They were a people who lived and thrived in a time of great upheaval, and their story is one of resilience and reinvention. It is a story that deserves to be told, not as a simple tale of enemies and warriors, but as a complex narrative of migration, identity, and cultural transformation. The Philistines were not just mythic figures from the pages of the Bible. They were real people who faced real challenges, who built cities, who traded with distant lands, and who fought to carve out a place for themselves in a world that was constantly changing. Their story is one of adaptation and resilience, a story that challenges us to rethink our assumptions about ancient peoples, about migration, and about the ways in which history is written. To understand the Philistines is not simply to uncover the past, but to reflect on how history is shaped by the stories we tell and the way we remember those who came before us. In the end, the Philistines are not just a group of ancient enemies, nor are they the crude invaders that history has sometimes painted them as. They are a people whose story is still unfolding, as new archaeological discoveries continue to reveal deeper layers of their culture and identity. To truly understand the Philistines is to question not just what we know about them, but also how we come to know anything at all about the past. The Philistines are a reminder that history is not a fixed narrative, but a living, breathing story, constantly being rewritten with each new discovery. And in that sense, their story is as relevant today as it ever was, inviting us to look beyond the myths and uncover the truths that lie hidden beneath the surface of the past. The story of the Philistines begins with a sense of mystery that surrounds the remnants of their once thriving cities, now reduced to ruin. For centuries, these cities stood as towering symbols of a civilization that ruled a stretch of coastline along the eastern Mediterranean, but as time wore on, they slipped into history's shadows, their once vibrant communities forgotten. The reason we know so little about the Philistines is not for lack of archaeological evidence but rather the fragmented nature of the records that have survived. These ancient remnants are like pieces of a puzzle, scattered across time, often pieced together only by inference, and almost always viewed through the lens of outsiders, those who had a vested interest in either preserving or condemning their memory. It is within the context of these lost cities that the true narrative of the Philistine people begins to emerge, not as a monolithic force of destruction, but as a complex society that once played an integral role in the ancient world. If one were to travel to the modern sites of Ashkelon, Gaza, or Ekron, they would find a far quieter landscape than the bustling cities of antiquity. These cities were once vibrant urban hubs, connected by trade routes that spanned the Mediterranean and beyond. Ashkelon, for instance, stood as one of the 5 Philistine city-states, a jewel of culture, commerce, and politics. It was a thriving metropolis that, like many ancient cities, had its own life cycle, born from the ebb and flow of migrations, wars, and shifts in regional power. But unlike the cities of the more famous ancient civilizations, Ashkelon, Gaza, and Ekron remain less well known to the modern public, overshadowed in large part by the biblical narrative of the Philistines as relentless enemies. Yet, if we look more closely at the remnants of their urban life, we can begin to piece together an image of a people who were far more than the caricatures that history often paints them as. These cities were strategically located along the fertile coastal plain of Canaan, a region rich in resources and trade routes. They were well positioned to exploit the economic potential of the area, facilitating the movement of goods between Africa, the Levant, and the rest of the Mediterranean. But what's remarkable is how these Philistine cities developed distinct architectural and cultural characteristics that set them apart from their Canaanite neighbors. As archaeologists sift through the ruins of these ancient sites, they uncover evidence of large, planned cities with well-constructed fortifications, residential areas, and religious centers. The layout of the city suggests a society that was not only organized but also innovative. The Philistines were among the first in the region to use advanced techniques in fortification, building massive city walls to defend against enemies and to demonstrate their power. In the ancient city of Ashkelon, archaeologists have uncovered a remarkable array of items that shed light on the sophistication of Philistine culture. From their distinctive pottery to the remains of grand temples, these artifacts tell a story of a people who valued both defense and art. The Philistines were skilled in metalwork, their weapons finely crafted from iron and bronze, some of which would have been used to arm their warriors in battle. But they were not just warriors. They also had an extensive trade network, importing and exporting goods from across the Mediterranean world. Evidence suggests that the Philistines were able to cultivate relationships with Egypt, the Aegean islands, and even distant regions like Anatolia. This trade, along with their natural resources, helped sustain their cities and allowed them to grow into powerful urban centers. However, it is not just their material wealth and military prowess that make the Philistines stand out. The urbanization of Philistine life was deeply intertwined with their religion and social structure. Religion played a central role in their communities, and the evidence of their temples and shrines suggests a society that was both pious and public in its devotion. One of the most well-known deities in the Philistine pantheon was Dagon, a god of fertility and grain, who was often depicted in the form of a human with the head of a fish. Dagon was not merely an object of worship, but a symbol of the Philistines' connection to the land and to the forces of nature that governed their survival. The presence of Dagon worship is a significant clue to understanding Philistine society, as it reveals the deep ties the Philistines had to agriculture and the cyclical nature of life. It also hints at the complex relationships they had with the gods of their neighbors, such as the Canaanites and the Egyptians. Despite their cultural accomplishments and their long-standing presence in the region, the Philistines were not immune to the forces of history. The rise and fall of civilizations, especially in the ancient world, were often marked by the tides of war and the shifting of political allegiances. The Philistines, much like the city-states of Greece or the empires of Mesopotamia, were constantly engaged in conflicts with their neighbors. However, their history cannot be reduced to simple stories of warfare or enmity. Their relationships with the Israelites, for example, were far more nuanced than the Bible's portrayal of the Philistines as unrelenting enemies. While it is true that the Philistines and the Israelites fought numerous battles, particularly in the legendary tales of David and Goliath, the relationship between the two peoples was not one of constant warfare. There were periods of peace and cooperation as well, periods in which the Philistines and Israelites engaged in trade, alliances, and even shared cultural practices. The tensions between the Philistines and their neighbors, particularly the Israelites, are often portrayed in the Bible as a battle of good versus evil, with the Philistines being cast as the oppressive forces. But these ancient texts reflect the perspective of the Israelites, and they were written long after the events took place. It is crucial to remember that the Philistines were seen through the lens of those who opposed them, and that their role in the biblical narrative was shaped by the need to define a group's identity by contrast. The portrayal of the Philistines as a barbaric or uncivilized people is as much a reflection of the Israelites' desire to present themselves as the chosen people of God as it is a reflection of the Philistines' actual character. This distortion of their identity continued throughout history, further perpetuated by historians, poets, and philosophers who had little direct knowledge of the Philistines but relied on the ancient texts. The Philistines were reduced to a stereotype: warriors without culture, enemies without reason, and migrants without roots. But this view has been increasingly challenged by modern archaeology, which paints a much richer picture of their society. The ruins of Ashkelon and Gaza, the burial sites, the pottery, and the inscriptions that have been uncovered tell a story of a people who were far from being mere invaders. They were a people who had their own cultural practices, their own ways of life, and their own contributions to the broader Mediterranean world. As we uncover more of their history, it becomes clear that the Philistines were not simply a footnote in the ancient world. They were an integral part of the complex web of civilizations that defined the Mediterranean during the Late Bronze Age and Early Iron Age. The city-states they established along the southern coast of Canaan were far more than military outposts. They were bustling urban centers, where trade, culture, and religion intertwined. These cities were microcosms of a society that was not only surviving but thriving in a turbulent period of history. The Philistines, in their own way, were both participants in and witnesses to the great transformations that were taking place in the ancient world. The story of the Philistines is one of survival and adaptation, a tale of a people who lived and thrived in the face of immense challenges. Their cities, their culture, their religion, and their interactions with their neighbors all speak to a society that was far more complex than the simple warrior narrative often portrayed. The evidence is there, waiting to be uncovered, not just in the archaeological record but in the way we choose to view the past. The Philistines were not a myth or a caricature, they were a people whose legacy has been hidden beneath centuries of misunderstanding and misrepresentation. The challenge now is to reframe their story, to move beyond the myths and the stereotypes, and to understand the Philistines as they truly were: innovative, resilient, and central to the tapestry of ancient Mediterranean life. The question of the origins of the Philistines has long been a subject of debate and speculation. For centuries, historians, archaeologists, and biblical scholars have grappled with the mystery of where they came from and how they came to settle along the coast of ancient Canaan. The traditional narrative has often painted them as invaders, arriving from distant lands to impose themselves on the indigenous populations of the Levant. The Bible describes them as the people of the sea, a group of enigmatic and hostile outsiders who arrived on the shores of Canaan from the Mediterranean Sea. This image of the Philistines as sudden invaders has become so entrenched in popular thought that it is difficult to imagine them as anything else. Yet, the more we explore the evidence, the more it becomes apparent that the story of their arrival in Canaan is far more complex and nuanced than this simple narrative suggests. The first significant clue to understanding the Philistines' origins comes not from biblical texts but from the archaeological record. The term "sea peoples" appears in ancient Egyptian inscriptions, particularly those of Pharaoh Ramses III, who records battles against a coalition of these mysterious groups. The sea peoples are depicted as marauders who sailed from the Aegean region and wreaked havoc on the eastern Mediterranean. In these accounts, the Philistines are identified as one of the groups of the sea peoples, alongside others like the Shurden, Peleset, and others whose names are often lost to time. However, while the Egyptians described these groups as enemies, the reality is far more complicated. The sea peoples were not a unified force, but rather a diverse collection of peoples from various Mediterranean regions, who came together for reasons that remain unclear. It is this context of upheaval and migration that provides a more accurate backdrop for understanding the origins of the Philistines. As we delve deeper into the archaeological evidence, it becomes clear that the Philistines were not merely a violent and disruptive force, but rather part of a larger migratory wave that swept through the eastern Mediterranean in the 12th century BCE. This was a time of great upheaval, as the great civilizations of the Bronze Age collapsed under the weight of invasions, internal strife, and economic decline. Cities that had once flourished in the Aegean and Anatolia were now in ruins, and populations were displaced, seeking refuge and new lands in which to settle. It is during this period of collapse that the Philistines, along with other groups of the Sea Peoples, made their way to the southern coast of Canaan. One of the most striking pieces of evidence linking the Philistines to the Aegean world is their distinctive pottery. Philistine pottery, known for its geometric patterns and bold designs, is markedly different from the pottery of their Canaanite neighbors. This pottery style closely resembles that of Mycenaean Greece, particularly the styles that emerged during the Late Bronze Age. The similarities between Philistine pottery and Mycenaean pottery are not limited to form and decoration, but also extend to the materials used in their production. The Philistines employed a technique of making pottery that was common in the Aegean world but not in Canaan. This stylistic and technological link between the Philistines and the Mycenaeans strongly suggests that they were connected to the Aegean region in some way, likely as part of the broader migratory movements of the time. Further evidence of the Philistines' Aegean origins comes from their architecture. The cities they built in Canaan, such as Ashkelon, Gaza, and Ekron, were constructed with an architectural style that bears a strong resemblance to Mycenaean designs. The use of large stone blocks in the construction of city walls and buildings, as well as the layout of the cities, shows a distinct architectural influence from the Aegean. This architectural style, combined with the pottery and other material culture, points to the Philistines' origins in the Aegean or, at the very least, to their close connections with the Aegean world. Yet, while the archaeological evidence points to an Aegean origin, it is important to recognize that the Philistines were not a homogeneous group of people who simply transplanted their culture to Canaan. The Philistines, like all migrant groups, interacted with the peoples they encountered, and over time, their culture absorbed influences from the Canaanites and other neighboring cultures. The blending of Aegean and Canaanite traditions is evident in the art, religion, and daily life of the Philistines. For example, while they worshipped Dagon, a god associated with fertility and agriculture, they also incorporated elements of Canaanite religious practices into their own worship. This cultural fusion is a testament to the adaptability and resilience of the Philistine people, who, rather than simply imposing their culture on the land, chose to merge and adapt their traditions to the realities of their new home. One of the most significant questions surrounding the Philistines' arrival in Canaan is whether they came as conquerors or as refugees. The evidence suggests that their arrival was not the result of a sudden invasion but rather part of a gradual migration process. This migration was likely driven by the collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations and the instability that followed. The Philistines were one of many groups that sought refuge in Canaan, a land that was still relatively untouched by the chaos engulfing the surrounding regions. It is likely that they arrived in waves, settling in the coastal cities where they could take advantage of the fertile land and access to trade routes. While they may have fought battles to establish themselves, their settlement in Canaan appears to have been a gradual process, one that involved negotiation and adaptation rather than outright conquest. Despite the many questions that remain unanswered about the origins of the Philistines, one thing is clear: their story is deeply intertwined with the broader history of migration in the ancient world. The movements of peoples across the Mediterranean during the Late Bronze Age and Early Iron Age were not merely a series of random events, but part of a larger process of cultural exchange and transformation. The Philistines were not an isolated group, they were part of a larger network of peoples who reshaped the cultural and political landscape of the ancient world. Their migration to Canaan was just one chapter in this larger story of upheaval and renewal. The question of who the Philistines were, and where they came from, is ultimately one of identity. They were not a people defined solely by their origins in the Aegean or their association with the Sea Peoples. They were a people who, through their migration, their interactions with the Canaanites, and their adaptation to the ancient world, created a unique and complex civilization. The Philistines were not a monolithic group, they were a people shaped by the forces of migration, warfare, and cultural exchange. As they settled in Canaan, they forged a new identity that blended elements from their Aegean past with the traditions of the people they encountered. In doing so, they became something entirely new, a civilization that was both foreign and familiar, both an invader and a settler, both a warrior and a merchant. As we continue to study the Philistines, we must resist the urge to view them through the lens of ancient animosity or simplistic narratives. Their story is not one of a people who arrived as conquerors, bent on destruction, but rather one of a group of people caught in the currents of history, seeking to rebuild their lives in a world that was rapidly changing. The Philistines were not the mythical enemies of the Israelites, nor were they the barbarians they have often been made out to be. They were a people whose identity was shaped by migration, adaptation, and cultural exchange, and whose legacy is one that continues to challenge our understanding of the ancient world. In the end, the question of the Philistines' origins is not just about where they came from, but about how we choose to view the past. The Philistines were not a simple story of foreign invaders, they were a people who, through their migration and adaptation, became an integral part of the ancient Mediterranean world. Their legacy is not one of destruction or myth, but of cultural exchange, resilience, and transformation. As we continue to uncover their story, we are reminded of the complexities of history, and the ways in which civilizations are born, shaped, and ultimately remembered. The identity of the Philistines has long been a subject of debate among scholars, historians, and archaeologists. Much of the image of the Philistines has been shaped by external sources, predominantly the Bible, Egyptian records, and later historians. These accounts often paint the Philistines as the quintessential other, a foreign and hostile group who arrived on the shores of Canaan with violent intentions, ready to conquer and subjugate the indigenous populations. Yet, as more evidence has emerged from archaeological digs and new analyses of ancient texts, a more nuanced picture of the Philistines begins to emerge, one that complicates the simplistic narrative of invaders and barbarians. The question arises, were the Philistines truly invaders, or were they simply a marginalized group of people, struggling to define themselves in an unfamiliar world, caught between their Aegean roots and the land they had settled on? In trying to answer this question, we must dig deeper into the cultural and historical context that shaped the Philistines' identity, a story that is anything but straightforward. To begin to understand the Philistine identity, we must first take a step back and examine the broader context of the ancient world during the time of their arrival in Canaan. The collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations around 1200 BCE had left the eastern Mediterranean in a state of turmoil and upheaval. Powerful empires such as the Mycenaeans, the Hittites, and the Egyptians were all experiencing their own crises, leading to widespread disintegration and the migration of various groups across the Mediterranean. These migrations were not merely the result of conquest but were deeply tied to the broader social, economic, and environmental pressures of the time. In this context, the Philistines were part of a wave of displaced peoples seeking new lands in which to settle. They were not just conquerors, they were survivors, part of a broader migratory movement that included many different peoples seeking refuge from the collapse of their homelands. In their new home on the southern coast of Canaan, the Philistines were confronted with a challenge: how to navigate the complex dynamics of a region already inhabited by the Canaanites. Rather than imposing themselves upon the local populations, the Philistines found themselves in a process of cultural interaction and integration. They adopted many elements of Canaanite culture, particularly in their religious practices, art, and everyday life. For example, while the Philistines worshipped their own gods, such as Dagon, the god of fertility, they also incorporated elements of Canaanite religious practices into their own beliefs, reflecting a blend of both Aegean and Canaanite traditions. This blending of cultures was not the result of mere domination but of adaptation, as the Philistines sought to carve out a new identity in a world where they were neither completely foreign nor fully integrated into the existing cultures around them. In addition to their religious practices, the Philistines also adopted elements of Canaanite material culture, including their architectural styles and methods of farming. The Philistine cities, such as Ashkelon, Gaza, and Ekron, reflect a blend of their Aegean roots and the indigenous Canaanite practices. While the Philistine cities were designed with advanced fortifications and urban planning, they also incorporated local building techniques and materials. The use of pottery, too, is an excellent example of how the Philistines adapted to their new environment. While their pottery retained strong Aegean influences, it also incorporated local Canaanite designs, creating a distinct style that was unique to their culture. This cultural fusion was not an attempt to erase or subjugate the local populations but rather an attempt to create a hybrid identity that reflected both their Aegean heritage and their new home in Canaan. The Philistine adaptation to their new environment was also reflected in their social and political structures. Unlike the more centralized kingdoms of the Canaanites or the Israelites, the Philistines established a system of city-states, each with its own ruler and autonomy. These city-states were bound together by a shared culture and common interests but were otherwise independent. This decentralized system of governance allowed the Philistines to maintain a sense of identity while also adapting to the political realities of their new environment. It was a pragmatic solution to the challenges they faced as migrants in a land already populated by other groups. Over time, the Philistines began to assimilate more fully into the fabric of Canaanite society, though they never completely lost their distinct identity. Their unique culture, with its blend of Aegean and Canaanite elements, continued to define them as a people, setting them apart from their neighbors even as they adapted to the world around them. While the Philistines were adapting to their new environment, they were also engaging in a process of self-definition. The Philistines were a people who were not easily categorized. On the one hand, they were migrants who had come from distant lands, bringing with them a unique set of cultural practices and beliefs. On the other hand, they were settlers who had established themselves in the land of Canaan, integrating into the local society while maintaining their distinct cultural identity. This duality, being both foreign and familiar, played a key role in the shaping of the Philistine identity. The Philistines were constantly negotiating their place in the world, defining themselves through their interactions with both their Aegean roots and the Canaanite societies they encountered. This tension between being an outsider and being part of the local community is most clearly seen in the way the Philistines were perceived by their neighbors. The biblical narrative, which frames the Philistines as the perennial enemies of the Israelites, depicts them as a foreign and barbaric people, constantly at odds with the Israelites and other neighboring cultures. Yet, this portrayal is far from the full picture. The Philistines were not simply enemies of the Israelites, they were also neighbors, trade partners, and occasionally allies. The evidence from archaeology suggests that, while conflict was certainly a part of the relationship between the Philistines and the Israelites, it was not the only part. There were periods of peace and cooperation between the two peoples, during which they exchanged goods, ideas, and even cultural practices. The Philistines were, in many ways, an integral part of the broader political and social landscape of the ancient Levant. The complexity of the Philistine identity is further complicated by the ways in which they were portrayed by later civilizations. In Greek and Roman accounts, the Philistines were often depicted as the archetype of the barbarian other, a term used to describe any people who were considered outside the sphere of Greek or Roman civilization. These later accounts, though written centuries after the fall of the Philistine city-states, continued to reinforce the image of the Philistines as an uncivilized, foreign people. This image of the Philistines as the barbarians at the gate persisted throughout history, contributing to their marginalization and misrepresentation. However, modern archaeological discoveries have begun to challenge this simplistic view, shedding light on the complexities of Philistine culture and society. Through these discoveries, we are beginning to see the Philistines not as a monolithic group of invaders but as a people whose identity was shaped by migration, adaptation, and cultural exchange. Ultimately, the story of the Philistines is not one of simple opposition or conquest. It is a story of survival, adaptation, and transformation. The Philistines were a people caught between two worlds, the Aegean world of their origins and the Canaanite world of their new home. Their identity was shaped by their migration, their interactions with the peoples around them, and their efforts to define themselves in a complex and changing world. The Philistines were not simply invaders, they were migrants, settlers, and builders of a unique civilization. By understanding their story in its full complexity, we can begin to appreciate the depth and richness of their culture and legacy, which has long been overshadowed by myth and misunderstanding. The Philistines were a people who, though often misunderstood and misrepresented, contributed to the rich tapestry of the ancient world. Their story is not just one of conflict and war but one of cultural exchange, adaptation, and survival. As we continue to uncover the remnants of their cities, their art, and their artifacts, we are reminded that the past is never as simple as it may seem. The Philistines were not the enemies of the Israelites, they were people in their own right, with their own struggles, triumphs, and complexities. And in the end, the question of who the Philistines truly were is not just about their identity, but about our own understanding of history and the way we choose to remember those who came before us. The rise and fall of ancient civilizations are often determined not just by their military prowess or political power but by the ways in which they manage and adapt to the challenges of their environment. For the Philistines, their story is inextricably linked to their relationship with the land they occupied. The coastal plains of Canaan, with their fertile soil and strategic location along vital trade routes, provided the Philistines with both opportunities and obstacles. Yet, despite the rich resources of the region, the land itself presented a series of challenges that shaped not only their cities but their entire way of life. Understanding how the Philistines adapted to their environment offers crucial insights into their culture, economy, and the very foundations of their society. The Philistine cities were strategically located along the coastal plain of Canaan, an area that was historically both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, the coastal location provided access to the Mediterranean Sea, offering valuable resources like fish, trade routes, and the ability to forge connections with other cultures around the Mediterranean basin. On the other hand, it made them vulnerable to the changing tides of history, particularly during the Late Bronze Age and early Iron Age when instability in the region was rampant. It is within this volatile context that the Philistines would build their cities, confront threats from neighbors, and seek to carve out a place for themselves in a world constantly in flux. The cities of the Philistines, including Ashkelon, Gaza, and Ekron, were marvels of ancient urban planning, designed not just for defense but for the efficient management of resources and trade. The layout of these cities shows a highly organized approach to urbanization. The Philistines were not just warriors, they were traders, craftsmen, and farmers who understood the importance of infrastructure. Their cities were surrounded by high city walls, massive fortifications meant to protect them from external threats. The use of thick stone walls was not unique to the Philistines but was certainly a defining characteristic of their cities. However, their fortifications were not merely practical, they were a testament to the Philistines' desire to assert their presence and dominance over the land they had settled on. These massive walls were built with the knowledge of architectural techniques borrowed from the Aegean and the Canaanites, demonstrating the Philistines' ability to adapt and incorporate outside influences into their own structures. But while the fortifications of their cities provided safety from invaders, the land they occupied also required the Philistines to develop a sophisticated system of agriculture. The fertile soil of the coastal plain provided the foundation for the Philistine economy, and the cultivation of crops was a key part of their livelihood. The evidence from excavation sites shows that the Philistines were highly skilled in farming and irrigation, using advanced techniques to maximize their agricultural output. They grew a wide variety of crops, from grains and vegetables to fruits and olives, all of which played a significant role in sustaining their population. The reliance on agriculture allowed the Philistines to support not only their urban centers but also a growing merchant class that traded goods with neighboring cultures, including the Egyptians, Canaanites, and even distant Aegean regions. However, despite the advantages of their coastal position, the Philistines were not immune to the cycles of warfare and instability that plagued the region during the time of their settlement. The Philistine cities were often in conflict with neighboring groups, especially the Israelites. The Bible, in its portrayal of the Philistines as constant enemies, focuses primarily on the battles and hostilities that marked their interactions with the Israelites. But these conflicts were not the only aspect of the Philistine experience. There were periods of relative peace, during which the Philistines were able to focus on trade, diplomacy, and internal development. These periods of calm allowed the Philistines to fortify their cities, expand their agricultural output, and develop their economy further. The Philistines, despite their reputation as warriors, were also skilled diplomats and traders, making them a formidable presence in the eastern Mediterranean. Trade was central to the Philistine economy, and their cities were major hubs for the exchange of goods. Archaeological evidence reveals that the Philistines traded with a wide range of cultures, including the Egyptians, the Phoenicians, and the Mycenaeans. The Philistine coast, with its access to the Mediterranean Sea, provided a natural gateway for goods coming from both the east and the west. The Philistines were involved in the exchange of luxury goods, such as precious metals, fine pottery, textiles, and even slaves, as well as more practical commodities like grain, wine, and olive oil. This trade network connected the Philistines to the broader world, giving them access to resources and ideas that would shape their culture and society. Their cities became bustling centers of commerce, where merchants from different regions would come to trade and exchange ideas. This interaction with other cultures influenced the development of the Philistine economy, as well as their art, religion, and social structure. Yet, the Philistines were not simply passive participants in the larger Mediterranean trade network. They were active agents in shaping the region's economic landscape. Evidence suggests that the Philistines were skilled craftsmen, particularly in the fields of metalworking and pottery. The Philistines are known for their distinctive pottery, which featured geometric patterns and vibrant colors that set them apart from their Canaanite neighbors. The pottery was not just decorative, it was functional, used for storing grain, wine, and oil, as well as for religious rituals. The quality of Philistine pottery was highly valued by other cultures, and it became an important export item. In addition to pottery, the Philistines were also skilled in working with metal, producing finely crafted weapons, tools, and ornaments. These metal goods were highly prized and played a key role in their trade relationships with neighboring cultures. However, the story of the Philistines is not just one of economic prosperity and cultural exchange. The land itself, with all its resources and opportunities, was also a battleground. The Philistines were constantly engaged in military conflicts, both to protect their cities from external threats and to expand their territory. The constant threat of invasion, whether from the Egyptians, the Israelites, or other neighboring groups, meant that the Philistines had to remain vigilant. Their cities were not just centers of commerce and culture, they were fortresses, built to withstand the pressures of a turbulent world. The Philistines' military campaigns, while often framed in terms of conquest and defense, were also shaped by the need to maintain their control over valuable resources, such as the fertile land along the coastal plain and the key trade routes that passed through their cities. The constant warfare and instability of the region took its toll on the Philistine cities. Despite their military prowess and their ability to adapt to their environment, the Philistines were ultimately unable to withstand the changing tides of history. In the 7th century BCE, the Philistine cities were conquered by the Babylonians, marking the end of their era as a dominant force in the eastern Mediterranean. The fall of the Philistine cities was part of a broader wave of destruction that swept through the region, as empires rose and fell and new powers emerged. Yet, even in defeat, the Philistines left behind a legacy that would endure in the archaeological record. The Philistines' relationship with the land they occupied was not just one of conquest and domination. It was a relationship defined by adaptation, resilience, and the ability to transform a foreign land into a home. The Philistine cities were built upon a foundation of agriculture, trade, and military defense, and their people adapted to the challenges posed by the land in ways that allowed them to thrive for centuries. Their agricultural practices, their urban planning, and their mastery of trade all played crucial roles in shaping their identity and their legacy. The Philistines were not merely invaders, they were settlers, builders, and craftsmen who made their mark on the land they called home. Even in the face of external threats and eventual conquest, the Philistines' relationship with the land remains a testament to their adaptability and their enduring influence on the history of the ancient world. The Philistines are often remembered as the iconic enemies of the Israelites, thanks in no small part to the biblical narratives that cast them as the perennial adversary. The famous story of David and Goliath, with its vivid image of the young Israelite hero slaying the towering Philistine warrior, has cemented this perception of the Philistines as a brute force, large, threatening, and seemingly monolithic. However, this portrayal, while deeply embedded in cultural memory, only scratches the surface of the reality of Philistine society. Far from being merely a faceless enemy to be vanquished, the Philistines were a people with a complex social structure, a rich cultural heritage, and a sophisticated understanding of politics and religion. To truly understand their significance in the ancient world, we must move beyond the Bible and look at the broader historical, archaeological, and cultural evidence that tells a much more intricate story of a people struggling to define themselves amidst a sea of competing civilizations. The Philistine society, like any other, was not merely shaped by its conflicts. Rather, it was the product of a mixture of different cultural influences, including the Aegean, Canaanite, and Egyptian worlds. While they were indeed shaped by their history as invaders and settlers, their true identity was defined by how they adapted to the land they occupied and the relationships they built with their neighbors. Archaeological evidence from their cities, such as Ashkelon, Gaza, Ekron, and Ashdod, suggests that the Philistines were more than just soldiers. They were skilled craftsmen, traders, and farmers. The cities they built were well-planned and heavily fortified, indicating a society that valued both defense and organized urban life. The intricate layouts of their cities, with designated residential, commercial, and religious zones, suggest a well-ordered society with clear divisions of labor and function. Socially, the Philistine cities were structured as city-states, each with its own leadership. This decentralized political system was not unique to the Philistines but was characteristic of many ancient civilizations in the Mediterranean region. This system allowed for a degree of autonomy in each city, though they shared a common language and culture. The political structure of the Philistines was likely influenced by their Aegean origins, where similar forms of city-state governance were common. The cities were ruled by local lords or chieftains, known as seranim in the biblical texts, who were responsible for managing the affairs of their city and ensuring its defense. These leaders likely had a great deal of power within their cities, but they also had to navigate the complex politics of the wider region, which was often in a state of flux due to the constant movements of other peoples, including the Egyptians, Israelites, and later, the Babylonians and Persians. One of the most significant aspects of Philistine society was its relationship with religion. Religion was not just a private affair, it was woven into the very fabric of everyday life. Like their Aegean forebears, the Philistines worshipped a pantheon of gods, the most prominent of which was Dagon, a god associated with fertility and agriculture. Dagon was typically depicted as a half-human, half-fish figure, a visual symbol of the Philistines' deep connection to the sea and the land. In addition to Dagon, other gods such as Ashtoreth, the goddess of fertility, and Baal-zebub, the god of healing, were worshipped. The Philistines were not isolated in their religious beliefs but rather participated in the religious practices of the broader Canaanite world. This blending of Canaanite and Aegean religious elements suggests a syncretic approach to faith, where the Philistines adapted the beliefs of their new home while retaining aspects of their original religious practices. The Philistines' religious practices were not confined to private rituals but were very much a public and communal activity. The presence of large temple complexes in cities such as Ekron and Ashkelon suggests that religion played a central role in the social and political life of the Philistine city-states. These temples were not just places of worship but also centers of political power. It is likely that the priests and religious leaders held significant influence within Philistine society, helping to guide both the spiritual and political direction of the cities. The connection between religion and politics in the Philistine world underscores the importance of maintaining divine favor, especially in the context of constant warfare and regional instability. The Philistine rulers, therefore, were not only military leaders but also religious figures, responsible for upholding the will of the gods and ensuring the prosperity of their cities. The relationship between the Philistines and the Israelites is one of the most enduring aspects of their historical legacy, but it is also one of the most complex. The Bible, particularly the book of Judges and the first book of Samuel, presents the Philistines as the Israelites' greatest enemies, their conflicts marked by bloody battles and deep animosity. The famous tale of David and Goliath, in which the young shepherd boy slays the giant warrior Goliath, is often taken as the archetypal symbol of Israelite victory over the Philistine oppressors. However, these biblical narratives, written from the perspective of the Israelites, do not offer the complete picture. While the Philistines and the Israelites did indeed engage in numerous conflicts, there is also evidence that suggests periods of peaceful coexistence and even cooperation between the two groups. Archaeological findings indicate that the Philistines and Israelites shared cultural practices and even traded goods at various points in their history. The Philistine cities were strategically located along the fertile coastal plain of Canaan, which gave them access to both agricultural resources and key trade routes. This location made them valuable allies and powerful adversaries. During certain periods, the Philistines were able to negotiate alliances with other regional powers, including the Egyptians. These alliances were often based on mutual interest, trade, security, and the balance of power in the region. During times of relative peace, the Philistines were able to build economic relationships with neighboring peoples, including the Israelites. This is reflected in the archaeological evidence, which shows that trade flourished between Philistine and Israelite cities, with goods such as olive oil, pottery, and grain passing between them. Despite these occasional periods of cooperation, the relationship between the two groups was often defined by conflict. The Israelites, particularly during the reign of King Saul and King David, viewed the Philistines as a constant threat. The Philistines, on the other hand, saw the Israelites as a potential obstacle to their dominance in the region. The story of David and Goliath, for instance, depicts the Philistines as a formidable military power, with Goliath representing the strength and terror of their army. Yet, as is often the case in history, the truth is more nuanced than these simple tales of good versus evil. The Philistines, like the Israelites, were driven by their own complex set of motivations, shaped by their history, culture, and the pressures of the environment in which they lived. In addition to their relationship with the Israelites, the Philistines were also in contact with other powerful civilizations of the ancient world, including the Egyptians, the Hittites, and the Babylonians. The Philistines were particularly influenced by Egyptian culture, as they maintained strong political and trade ties with the pharaohs for much of their history. Evidence suggests that the Philistines were involved in Egyptian military campaigns and that they occasionally served as mercenaries or allies to the Egyptian rulers. These connections with Egypt further complicated the Philistines' role in the ancient world, as they were able to draw on the power and resources of one of the most advanced civilizations of the time while still retaining their own distinct identity. The collapse of the Philistine city-states came in the 7th century BCE, when the Babylonians, under King Nebuchadnezzar II, conquered much of the region, including the Philistine cities. This period marked the end of the Philistine civilization as a significant power in the ancient world. However, the legacy of the Philistines did not disappear entirely. Their cities were abandoned, and their influence waned, but their contributions to the cultural and economic fabric of the ancient Mediterranean world continued to resonate. Their distinctive pottery, their city layouts, and their religious practices left an indelible mark on the region. Even in their decline, the Philistines were an important part of the ancient Mediterranean mosaic, a people whose legacy continued to shape the history of the region long after their cities had fallen. The story of the Philistines is a story of survival, adaptation, and complexity. Far from being simply the enemies of the Israelites or the invaders from the sea, the Philistines were a people who carved out a space for themselves in the ancient world through a combination of warfare, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. Their cities were bustling centers of trade, culture, and religion, and their influence stretched across the Mediterranean. The Philistines were not just warriors, they were builders, traders, and craftsmen who created a lasting impact on the history of the ancient Near East. The rise of the Philistines as a formidable presence in the ancient Levant can be traced back to their migration into the coastal cities of Canaan, a land already inhabited by indigenous groups with their own deep-rooted histories and cultures. The Philistines, often referred to as part of the Sea Peoples, are thought to have arrived in waves during a period of great upheaval around the 12th century BCE, a time when the Mediterranean world was experiencing the collapse of great Bronze Age civilizations. Their entry into Canaan, marked by their settlement along the coastal plain, was not just an act of conquest or colonization but part of a much broader pattern of movement and migration that reshaped the region. While the biblical account and ancient records often depict the Philistines as invaders bent on domination, the reality of their settlement and cultural integration is far more intricate. These newcomers, often framed as aggressive and barbaric, were in many ways assimilating into a diverse and complex environment. Their adaptation to the land, their interactions with neighboring cultures, and the eventual creation of a unique Philistine identity suggest a story of survival, resilience, and the complexities of cultural exchange. The Philistines did not merely displace the people of Canaan, rather, they coexisted and intermingled with the existing populations, becoming part of the intricate mosaic of the ancient Near East. Archaeological evidence reveals that the Philistines did not simply replicate their Aegean homeland but instead engaged in a process of hybridization. Their material culture, especially in the areas of pottery, architecture, and urban planning, displays significant influences from both their Aegean origins and the indigenous Canaanite traditions. The Philistines' distinctive pottery, known for its geometric patterns and dark burnished finishes, provides a key insight into this blending of cultural influences. While the forms and techniques used in their pottery bear resemblance to Mycenaean styles from the Aegean, their decorative motifs and methods of production also show a clear understanding of the local Canaanite traditions. This fusion of styles was not limited to pottery but extended to the construction of their cities, religious practices, and even social structures. The Philistine cities, such as Ashkelon, Ekron, and Gaza, were meticulously planned, reflecting a sophisticated urban design that borrowed from both Aegean and Canaanite models. Their cities were fortified with massive walls, and their layouts featured planned streets and public spaces, a testament to their organizational skills and ability to adapt to their new surroundings. At the heart of the Philistine cities was religion, which played a central role in shaping both their identity and their relationship with the land they inhabited. The Philistines worshipped a variety of deities, with the god Dagon being the most prominent. Dagon was a god associated with fertility, agriculture, and the sea, embodying the dual nature of Philistine society, which relied on both the land and the Mediterranean Sea for sustenance. The worship of Dagon reflects the Philistines' deep connection to their environment, where agriculture, fishing, and trade played critical roles in their survival. In addition to Dagon, the Philistines also venerated other gods, such as Ashtoreth, the goddess of fertility, and Baal-zebub, the god of healing. This pantheon of gods indicates the Philistines' syncretic approach to religion, blending their Aegean traditions with the religious practices of the Canaanites and other neighboring peoples. The Philistine religious centers, particularly the temples and high places, were focal points of both spiritual and political life. These sacred spaces were not just places of worship but also centers of power, where rulers and priests worked in tandem to ensure the prosperity of their cities. The temples were often located in the heart of the cities, close to the marketplaces and public spaces, symbolizing the integration of religion and daily life. The close connection between the political and religious spheres meant that the leaders of the Philistine cities, known as Saranim, were not only military and political figures but also religious authorities. This dual role gave them immense power, as they were responsible for maintaining the favor of the gods and ensuring the well-being of their people. Yet, the Philistines' relationship with the land and its people was not without conflict. The biblical narratives, particularly those found in the books of Judges and Samuel, paint a picture of constant warfare between the Philistines and the Israelites. The Philistines are portrayed as a powerful and technologically advanced enemy, capable of defeating the Israelites in battle and dominating large parts of the region. The most famous of these conflicts is the story of David and Goliath, in which the young Israelite hero defeats the towering Philistine warrior, Goliath, in a dramatic showdown. This biblical portrayal of the Philistines as fierce enemies is not entirely without basis. The Philistines did indeed pose a serious threat to the Israelites, and their military prowess was formidable. However, this image of the Philistines as solely an enemy force overlooks the complex reality of their interactions with other cultures in the region, including the Israelites. While the Philistines and Israelites were often in conflict, there were also periods of relative peace and cooperation. Archaeological evidence suggests that trade and cultural exchange took place between the two groups, with goods such as pottery, olive oil, and grain being exchanged. These interactions were not solely limited to commerce but also included the sharing of religious ideas and practices. The Philistines' presence in the southern Levant coincided with the rise of the Israelites as a distinct political and cultural entity, and the two peoples found themselves frequently in competition for resources, land, and political influence. Despite the tension, the relationship between the Philistines and the Israelites was not purely antagonistic. There were times when both groups lived side by side, each shaping the other in ways that are only now becoming apparent through archaeological studies. The Philistines' military power and their status as a significant regional force were also influenced by their access to advanced technologies, particularly ironworking. The Philistines were among the first to develop and widely use iron weapons, which gave them a significant advantage over their neighbors, including the Israelites, who were still primarily using bronze weaponry. This technological superiority enabled the Philistines to establish themselves as dominant forces in the region. Their iron weapons, including swords, spears, and chariots, were superior in both quality and effectiveness, and their use of iron made them formidable opponents on the battlefield. This advantage, however, did not guarantee their long-term success, as the Philistine cities were eventually overcome by the rising power of the Babylonians and later the Persians, marking the end of their civilization as a dominant force. Despite their eventual decline, the legacy of the Philistines lived on through their material culture and the lasting impact they had on the societies around them. The Philistines left behind a rich archaeological record, with their cities, pottery, and religious artifacts providing valuable insights into their way of life. The distinctiveness of their material culture, with its blend of Aegean and Canaanite influences, has made the Philistines a fascinating subject of study for historians and archaeologists. Their cities, although eventually abandoned, were once bustling centers of trade, culture, and religion, where people from diverse backgrounds and cultures interacted and exchanged ideas. As we examine the Philistines' relationship with the land, it becomes clear that their story is one of adaptation and resilience. The Philistines did not simply invade and conquer, they settled, built, and transformed the region they occupied. Their cities became thriving centers of trade, culture, and innovation, where the influence of both their Aegean origins and the local Canaanite traditions blended to create a distinctive civilization. While they were often at odds with their neighbors, including the Israelites, the Philistines also contributed to the broader cultural and political landscape of the ancient Levant. Their legacy, shaped by their interactions with the land, the people, and the cultures around them, endures to this day, providing a glimpse into the complexities of ancient societies and the ways in which they navigated the challenges of their time. The Philistine story, then, is not one of mere conquest or destruction but one of survival and transformation. In their new home along the southern coast of Canaan, the Philistines navigated the complexities of migration, adaptation, and cultural exchange. Their cities, religious practices, and material culture tell the story of a people who sought to define themselves in a foreign land and who, in doing so, created a legacy that would endure long after their civilization had fallen. Their rise, their conflicts, and their eventual decline were all part of a larger narrative of change and resilience that defined the ancient world. And, in the end, the Philistine story is a testament to the power of adaptation, the importance of cultural exchange, and the enduring impact of migration in shaping the course of history. The question of whether the Philistines were merely a group of sea-born invaders or a people who adapted and evolved over time in their new homeland is one that has occupied scholars for centuries. The prevailing narrative, especially from the Bible, paints them as a barbaric and foreign people, locked in perpetual conflict with the Israelites. However, this simplistic view fails to capture the nuances of Philistine society. As new archaeological evidence continues to shed light on their lives, we begin to understand the Philistines as a complex people, both shaped by their environment and, in turn, shaping the ancient world around them. The Philistine arrival in the southern Levant is traditionally associated with the so-called Sea Peoples, a term used to describe a coalition of groups who were responsible for the collapse of several great civilizations around the 12th century BCE. It was a period marked by upheaval, as the Bronze Age world transitioned into the Iron Age. Theories abound about where the Sea Peoples originated. Some scholars point to the Aegean, others suggest they may have come from Anatolia or even the western Mediterranean. What is clear, however, is that these groups, including the Philistines, were displaced by the collapse of the Mycenaean kingdoms and sought new territories in which to settle. The Philistines, specifically, are believed to have settled along the coastal plain of Canaan, a region rich in agricultural potential but also fiercely contested. This coastal strip, which stretched from modern-day Gaza to the borders of Egypt, became the heartland of Philistine civilization. Their settlements, Ashkelon, Gaza, Ekron, Ashdod, and Gath, were strategically positioned along major trade routes, offering them access to both Mediterranean and Near Eastern markets. Yet, their presence in this region was not merely that of conquerors and colonizers. The Philistines did not seek to exterminate the indigenous Canaanite populations, rather, they found ways to coexist and, in many respects, assimilate into the cultural and political fabric of the region. The process of integration was not without its challenges. The Philistines, though coming from an Aegean cultural background, had to adjust to a radically different climate, landscape, and set of societal norms. They were not simply invaders seeking to impose their way of life upon the land, they were migrants trying to find their place in a new world. This is where the story of their identity becomes interesting. Rather than seeking to entirely eradicate the cultures around them, the Philistines adapted, hybridizing their Aegean roots with the established Canaanite traditions. They brought with them distinctive pottery styles, as well as Aegean methods of metalworking, which were employed to craft advanced weapons and tools. Yet, at the same time, they adopted local architectural techniques and farming practices, creating a material culture that was distinctly Philistine, yet deeply rooted in the land they had come to inhabit. Evidence of this hybridization is particularly evident in their urban centers. The Philistine cities were marvels of early Iron Age urban planning. While they borrowed heavily from Canaanite designs, particularly in their use of courtyards and public spaces, there was also an unmistakable Aegean influence in their architecture. The Philistine cities were designed to be easily defensible, with walls built not just for protection but to project an image of strength and resilience. These fortifications were constructed using massive stone blocks, a technique that reflects both Canaanite and Aegean methods of stonework. Inside these cities, the streets were laid out in a grid pattern, a feature common to Aegean settlements but not typical of their Canaanite neighbors. The layout of these cities speaks to the Philistines' need for order and control, yet it also demonstrates their ability to adapt their Aegean heritage to the realities of life in the Levant. The Philistines were not just concerned with building cities, however. Their relationship with the land was also central to their survival. The coastal plain where they settled was rich in natural resources, but it also required sophisticated methods of agriculture to make it truly productive. The Philistines, drawing on both their Aegean and Canaanite knowledge, developed advanced irrigation systems to cultivate the land, growing crops such as barley, wheat, and olives. They were particularly skilled in the cultivation of vineyards, which played a key role in their economy. The Philistines' mastery of agriculture and their strategic location along trade routes allowed them to build a prosperous economy, which, in turn, supported their military efforts and reinforced their political influence in the region. Yet, their prosperity and growth came at a cost. The Philistines, as they settled along the southern Levant, found themselves in constant tension with neighboring peoples, particularly the Israelites. The Bible, written from the perspective of the Israelites, portrays the Philistines as a continuous threat, often framing their encounters as a battle between good and evil. This perspective, while historically grounded in certain military conflicts, fails to provide a comprehensive view of Philistine society. The Philistines, like their neighbors, were engaged in a struggle for survival and dominance, and their battles with the Israelites were not just about religious or ethnic differences. These conflicts were also deeply tied to the control of land, resources, and trade routes, issues that were central to all ancient societies. However, the relationship between the Philistines and the Israelites was not solely defined by conflict. Archaeological evidence suggests that, at times, the two groups coexisted peacefully, engaging in trade and sharing cultural practices. While there were certainly periods of intense warfare, there were also moments of cooperation. For example, the Philistines were skilled in metallurgy and produced finely crafted iron tools and weapons. These were highly prized by neighboring peoples, including the Israelites, who often traded with the Philistines to obtain these superior goods. Moreover, the evidence suggests that the Philistines and the Israelites may have participated in joint religious and cultural practices at times, exchanging religious ideas and symbols. Religion played an important role in shaping Philistine society. The Philistines worshipped a pantheon of gods, most notably Dagon, the god of fertility and agriculture, who was closely associated with the sea and the land. Dagon's prominence in Philistine religious life speaks to their deep connection to the natural world, particularly the coastal environment in which they settled. Dagon was not just a god of fertility, but also a god of protection, invoked to safeguard the Philistines from their many enemies. The Philistines' religious practices were not static, however, they absorbed elements from neighboring cultures, including the Canaanites and Egyptians. Evidence from excavated sites reveals that Philistine religious rituals involve large temples and shrines, where both private and public offerings were made to the gods. These religious spaces were not just places of worship but also symbols of power and authority, demonstrating the close relationship between religion and politics in Philistine society. The Philistines' cultural and religious practices were further enriched by their interactions with other civilizations. Their proximity to Egypt meant that they had significant contact with one of the most powerful and advanced cultures of the ancient world. The Philistines and Egyptians had a complex relationship, one marked by both conflict and cooperation. At times, the Philistines served as mercenaries in the Egyptian army, providing military support during Egyptian campaigns. At other times, the two powers clashed over control of the region. Despite these tensions, the Philistines absorbed many elements of Egyptian culture, including art, architecture, and religious iconography. This interaction with Egypt helped to further define the Philistine identity, making it even more distinctive in the context of the ancient world. Despite their military might and cultural sophistication, the Philistine cities eventually fell to the Babylonians in the 7th century BCE. The conquest of the Philistine cities marked the end of their independence, but their legacy did not vanish overnight. The archaeological record tells the story of a people who were not merely invaders but who contributed significantly to the cultural and political landscape of the ancient Near East. The Philistines' influence can be seen in the development of trade networks, the spread of technological innovations, and the blending of religious and cultural practices that characterized the region for centuries after their fall. Even in their defeat, the Philistines left behind a lasting imprint on the ancient world, one that continues to intrigue scholars and historians to this day. In the end, the Philistine story is not just one of invasion and war. It is a story of adaptation, survival, and transformation. The Philistines did not simply impose themselves upon the land they came to inhabit, they became part of it, blending their Aegean roots with the indigenous cultures of Canaan. Their cities, their religious practices, and their way of life reflect a civilization that was as complex as it was resilient. And though they eventually faded from the historical stage, their legacy remains a testament to the enduring power of migration, cultural exchange, and the transformation of identity. The story of the Philistines, much like the civilizations they interacted with, is one defined by both grandeur and decline. For a period, they were the epitome of power in the southern Levant, a people whose military might, cultural innovations, and strategic location enabled them to shape the course of history in profound ways. Yet, as with many great civilizations, their influence was not destined to last forever. Over time, internal strife, external pressures, and shifting geopolitical landscapes began to erode their once thriving society, leading to their eventual downfall. The reasons behind the collapse of the Philistine cities are complex and multifaceted, intertwined with larger regional shifts and the inevitable rise of new powers. Understanding the causes of their fall not only offers insight into the fate of the Philistines but also serves as a reflection of the cyclical nature of history itself. At the height of their power, the Philistines were a formidable presence in the ancient world. Their cities, such as Ashkelon, Gaza, Ekron, and Ashdod, stood as fortified strongholds, bustling centers of commerce and culture. The strategic location of these cities along the southern coastal plain of Canaan allowed the Philistines to control vital trade routes between Egypt, the Levant, and the Mediterranean world. Their influence stretched beyond their immediate borders, as they engaged in trade with distant civilizations, including the Egyptians, the Phoenicians, and even the Mycenaeans. The Philistine economy flourished, driven by their agricultural prowess, access to natural resources, and, notably, their expertise in metallurgy. Ironworking, a skill they had mastered, gave them a distinct advantage over their neighbors, particularly the Israelites, who were still largely dependent on bronze for their weapons and tools. The iron swords, shields, and chariots produced by the Philistines were highly sought after, solidifying their military strength and their place as one of the dominant powers in the region. But as with all powerful empires, the seeds of decline were already being sown long before the eventual collapse. One of the primary factors contributing to the decline of the Philistines was the shifting balance of power in the ancient Near East. The Philistine cities, while formidable, were not immune to the broader geopolitical changes taking place in the region. The rise of the Neo-Assyrian Empire in the 9th century BCE marked the beginning of a new era of imperialism in the ancient world. As the Assyrians expanded their territory, their ambitions inevitably brought them into conflict with the smaller, independent city-states of the Levant, including the Philistines. The Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser III, for example, launched a series of military campaigns aimed at consolidating power in the region, and by the 8th century BCE, the Assyrians had begun to exert their influence over the Philistine cities. The relationship between the Philistines and the Assyrians was not one of direct conquest but rather one of vassalage and tribute. The Assyrians, in their quest for dominance, sought to ensure that the city-states of the Levant, including the Philistines, remained loyal and subservient. To do so, they imposed heavy tributes upon the Philistines, which strained their economic stability. The once thriving trade networks that had sustained the Philistine cities were disrupted, and their access to valuable resources was limited. While the Philistines retained a degree of autonomy, the constant pressure from the Assyrians undermined their ability to function as independent city-states. The sense of security and prosperity that had once defined Philistine society began to erode, as the Philistines found themselves increasingly caught in the web of Assyrian domination. In addition to the external pressure from the Assyrians, the Philistine cities also faced internal challenges that weakened their political cohesion. The decentralized nature of Philistine governance, with each city-state operating under its own local ruler, made it difficult for them to mount a unified defense against external threats. While this system allowed for a degree of local autonomy, it also meant that the Philistines were more vulnerable to external pressures. The absence of a central, unifying authority meant that the cities were often unable to coordinate their efforts in times of crisis. This lack of political unity was a key factor in their eventual downfall, as the Assyrians, with their highly organized and centralized military machine, were able to exploit these divisions. The internal strife within Philistine society was also fueled by the ongoing conflicts with neighboring peoples, particularly the Israelites. While the Philistines and Israelites had periods of peaceful coexistence and even trade, their relationship was also marked by fierce rivalry and warfare. The biblical account of the wars between the two groups, most notably the story of David and Goliath, highlights the long-standing animosity between the Philistines and Israelites. This animosity was not just based on religious or cultural differences but also on the competition for control of resources and territory. As the Philistine cities expanded, they encroached on lands held by the Israelites, leading to frequent clashes and military campaigns. The internal divisions within Philistine society, coupled with the ongoing conflict with the Israelites, further weakened their ability to resist the external threats they faced. As the Assyrian Empire continued to expand its reach, it became clear that the Philistine cities could no longer maintain their independence. By the end of the 8th century BCE, the Philistine cities were firmly under Assyrian control. The Assyrians, known for their brutal methods of conquest, imposed harsh measures on the Philistine population, including the deportation of large numbers of people and the destruction of their cities. The once vibrant urban centers of Ashkelon, Gaza, and Ekron were systematically dismantled, their walls and buildings reduced to rubble. The Philistine people, now subjugated to Assyrian rule, saw their culture, economy, and way of life unravel. The Philistine identity, forged through centuries of adaptation and resilience, was slowly absorbed into the larger Assyrian Empire. However, the fall of the Philistine cities did not mark the complete disappearance of their civilization. While the Philistines were no longer a dominant force in the region, their legacy endured in the form of their material culture, religious practices, and contributions to the broader ancient world. Archaeological evidence reveals that elements of Philistine culture were absorbed by other societies in the Levant, including the Israelites. The distinctive Philistine pottery, metalworking techniques, and architectural styles left a lasting imprint on the region. Moreover, the Philistine religious practices, particularly the worship of gods like Dagon, continued to influence the religious practices of neighboring peoples long after the fall of their cities. The story of the Philistine collapse is ultimately one of transformation rather than total annihilation. While their cities were destroyed, their people were not wiped out entirely. Many Philistines were absorbed into the larger Assyrian and later Babylonian empires, their culture and traditions woven into the fabric of these new powers. Over time, the Philistines faded into history, their once proud cities reduced to ruins. Yet, in the collective memory of the ancient world, they lived on as a symbol of both the fragility and resilience of civilizations. The Philistines, whose identity was shaped by migration, adaptation, and conflict, left an indelible mark on the ancient world, one that continues to fascinate scholars and historians to this day. The collapse of the Philistine cities serves as a poignant reminder of the cyclical nature of history. Civilizations rise and fall, often driven by a combination of internal and external forces. The Philistines, once masters of the southern Levant, succumbed to the pressures of larger empires, their cities eventually falling to the overwhelming might of the Assyrians. Yet, their story is not one of complete destruction, rather, it is one of cultural assimilation and transformation. The Philistines, through their interactions with neighboring peoples and their contributions to the broader ancient world, ensured that their legacy endured long after their civilization had passed into history. In the end, the fall of the Philistine cities serves as both a cautionary tale and a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. It reminds us that even in the face of overwhelming odds, civilizations can leave a lasting imprint on the world. Though the Philistines were eventually conquered, their influence can still be felt in the cultural, religious, and archaeological record. Their story is a reminder that even in defeat, a civilization's legacy can endure, shaping the course of history for centuries to come. The story of the Philistines is as much about the people who lived within the borders of their cities as it is about the shifting tides of power that shaped their destiny. For centuries, they thrived as one of the prominent forces in the ancient world, carving out a civilization along the southern coast of Canaan. Yet, their demise, marked by the eventual conquest of their cities and the erosion of their cultural identity, raises fundamental questions about what happens to a civilization when it is absorbed into a larger empire. The Philistines were not merely defeated, they were transformed, their once independent cities swallowed by the greater geopolitical shifts that reshaped the ancient Near East. Their fall, however, did not spell the end of their story. Instead, it marked the beginning of their transformation into a symbol of cultural integration and historical legacy. The fall of the Philistine cities can be largely attributed to the rise of powerful empires that began to dominate the region in the first millennium BCE. The Assyrians, with their military might and centralized bureaucracy, became the primary external threat that the Philistine city-states could not withstand. The Assyrian Empire, renowned for its brutal military tactics and imperial strategies, sought to consolidate control over the Levant by subjugating smaller and independent city-states. The Philistine cities, with their strategic coastal locations and resources, were particularly appealing targets for Assyrian expansion. Over the course of several campaigns, the Assyrians gradually forced the Philistines to submit, imposing heavy tribute, and eventually, outright conquest. In addition to the external military threats, the Philistine cities were plagued by internal divisions. Unlike some of their neighbors, the Philistines did not have a centralized, unified system of governance. Instead, they were organized as a collection of independent city-states, each with its own ruler or chieftain. While this decentralized system allowed for a degree of local autonomy, it also made it difficult for the Philistines to mount a coordinated defense against external threats, including the might of the Assyrians. This internal fragmentation made it easier for the Assyrians to pick off the Philistine cities one by one, each conquest weakening the Philistines' ability to resist the larger forces at play. The downfall of the Philistine cities was not sudden, it was a gradual erosion of their power and independence. Ashkelon, one of the wealthiest and most important Philistine cities, was the first to fall to the Assyrians in 738 BCE. This was followed by the capture of other key cities such as Gaza and Ekron. Over time, the Assyrians incorporated the Philistine cities into their empire, extracting tribute and imposing their rule. The Philistine elites, once the rulers of independent city-states, were now subjects of a foreign power. For the Philistine people, this was a profound shift. The once vibrant cities, with their distinctive pottery, religious practices, and social structures, began to lose their individuality as they were subsumed into the larger Assyrian Empire. Despite their fall, the legacy of the Philistines did not vanish completely. While their cities were abandoned or repopulated by other peoples, their material culture lived on. Archaeological evidence reveals that Philistine pottery and religious artifacts continued to influence the societies that succeeded them. The distinctive Philistine pottery, with its bold geometric patterns and dark burnished surfaces, was not only used within the Philistine cities but also found its way into neighboring regions, suggesting that elements of Philistine culture persisted long after the collapse of their political power. This continuity of material culture speaks to the resilience of the Philistine identity, even in the face of conquest and transformation. The Philistine religion, too, left its mark on the region. Dagon, the primary Philistine god, continued to be worshipped by other peoples in the region even after the fall of the Philistine cities. Evidence from archaeological sites in the Levant suggests that the Philistine cult of Dagon spread to other parts of Canaan and beyond, influencing the religious practices of neighboring civilizations. The persistence of Philistine religious practices is a testament to the cultural exchange that took place in the ancient Near East. Even in the face of political subjugation, the Philistines' religious beliefs and rituals were not easily erased. Instead, they became part of the broader religious landscape of the region. While the Philistines were eventually absorbed into larger empires, their influence did not disappear entirely. The cities they had once built, with their fortifications, trade networks, and agricultural systems, left a lasting imprint on the landscape. The Philistine cities were not just military strongholds, they were thriving centers of culture, religion, and commerce. Their economy, built on agriculture, trade, and metallurgy, had a significant impact on the wider region. The ironworking techniques developed by the Philistines, for example, were passed on to neighboring cultures, influencing the development of metalworking throughout the Levant and beyond. Similarly, their contributions to the field of architecture, particularly their use of large stone blocks in city construction, were adopted by other civilizations, leaving behind a tangible legacy of their once great civilization. In the centuries following the fall of the Philistine cities, their legacy was absorbed into the broader cultural fabric of the ancient Near East. The rise of the Babylonians and later the Persians further transformed the region, but the Philistines' contributions to trade, technology, and religion were incorporated into these new empires. While the Philistines themselves faded into history, their cultural and technological innovations continued to influence the civilizations that succeeded them. In many ways, the Philistine experience is a reflection of the broader processes of cultural assimilation that took place throughout the ancient world. The Philistines, who had once been migrants seeking a new home, eventually became part of the larger historical narrative of the ancient Near East. Their story is one of adaptation, survival, and eventual integration into a larger imperial framework. The Philistines did not vanish as a distinct people, rather, they were absorbed into the empires that followed, their legacy carried forward through the material culture they left behind. Yet, the disappearance of the Philistine city-states also raises important questions about the nature of cultural identity and survival in the face of imperial conquest. What happens to a civilization when it is absorbed by a larger power? How much of a people's identity can be retained when their political independence is lost? In the case of the Philistines, the answer seems to lie in the persistence of their cultural practices, religious beliefs, and material culture. While their cities were destroyed and their political power dissolved, the core elements of Philistine life, such as their distinctive pottery, their ironworking techniques, and their religious rituals, continued to influence the broader region long after the fall of their cities. The collapse of the Philistine cities, while tragic in many respects, is also a reminder of the complex and interconnected nature of ancient history. The Philistines were not an isolated group, they were part of a vast web of interactions, conflicts, and exchanges that defined the ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern worlds. Their rise and fall were influenced not only by the actions of external powers but also by the ongoing dynamics of migration, trade, and cultural exchange that characterized the ancient world. The story of the Philistines is a testament to the resilience of cultures and identities in the face of change. It is a reminder that, while political power may be fleeting, cultural legacies can endure, often in ways that are far less visible but no less significant. As the Philistines faded from the historical stage, their legacy lived on in the cultures and civilizations that followed. Their cities, though abandoned and repopulate, left behind a lasting imprint on the landscape. Their religious practices, though absorbed by other peoples, continued to shape the spiritual life of the region. And their contributions to technology, agriculture, and trade continued to influence the ancient world long after their political dominance had faded. The Philistines, in the end, were not just a people who rose and fell, they were a civilization whose legacy lived on in ways both subtle and profound, shaping the course of history for generations to come. The story of the Philistines, like many ancient civilizations, is one that continues to evolve as new discoveries are made, shedding light on the complexities of their society and their interactions with their neighbors. When we consider the Philistines, their story is often overshadowed by their conflicts with the Israelites, as recorded in biblical texts. However, these accounts, while historically significant, provide only a partial view of who the Philistines were. What the Bible often portrays as a simple dichotomy of good versus evil, Israelites versus Philistines, fails to capture the true depth of their culture, their political organization, and their role in the broader context of the ancient Near East. As scholars continue to excavate Philistine sites and analyze ancient artifacts, a more nuanced picture of the Philistines is emerging, one that highlights not only their military prowess but also their advancements in agriculture, metallurgy, and urban planning. Much of what we know about the Philistines comes from archaeological evidence. Excavations in ancient cities like Ashkelon, Gaza, Ekron, and Ashdod have revealed a wealth of information about the Philistine way of life. Their distinctive pottery, often decorated with intricate geometric patterns, is one of the most recognizable elements of their material culture. This pottery, which was used for everyday purposes, as well as ceremonial items, reflects the Philistines' artistic sensibilities and their trade connections with other cultures in the Mediterranean and Near East. The designs on Philistine pottery show clear Aegean influences, indicating that the Philistines were likely part of the group known as the Sea Peoples, who migrated to the eastern Mediterranean from the Aegean during the Late Bronze Age. However, while Aegean motifs are prominent, there is also evidence of a strong Canaanite influence, suggesting that the Philistines were not just foreign invaders but were engaged in a process of cultural exchange and adaptation to their new environment. This process of hybridization extended beyond their pottery. Philistine architecture also reveals a blend of Aegean and Canaanite traditions. The city of Ekron, for example, was built with large, fortified walls and gates that were characteristic of Canaanite city planning. Yet, the layout of the city, with its organized streets and public spaces, shows evidence of Aegean influences. This combination of Canaanite and Aegean architectural styles suggests that the Philistines, while maintaining their cultural identity, were also open to integrating elements from the surrounding cultures. This flexibility, this ability to adapt and absorb new ideas, was one of the reasons why the Philistines were able to thrive in the Levant for several centuries. Beyond their material culture, the Philistines made significant contributions to the technological advancements of the ancient world. Perhaps one of their most important innovations was their mastery of ironworking. While the use of bronze for weapons and tools was still common throughout much of the ancient Near East, the Philistines were among the first to widely adopt and refine the use of iron. The production of iron weapons and tools gave the Philistines a distinct military advantage, particularly in their conflicts with their neighbors, including the Israelites. The Bible, in fact, records several instances in which the Israelites are described as lacking iron weapons, with the Philistines holding a monopoly on iron smelting and weaponry. This technological superiority allowed the Philistines to dominate the battlefield, and their iron chariots, swords, and spears were feared by many of their neighbors. But the Philistines' technological prowess was not limited to warfare. Their skill in metalworking also extended to everyday tools and agricultural implements. The iron plow, for example, was an important innovation that enabled the Philistines to improve their agricultural productivity. The fertile coastal plain of Canaan, which was ideal for farming, became the backbone of Philistine society. The Philistines' ability to harness the power of iron for agricultural purposes allowed them to increase crop yields, which in turn supported the growth of their cities and the expansion of their economy. Agriculture was not the only sector in which the Philistines demonstrated ingenuity. Their control of the coastal trade routes allowed them to engage in commerce with distant civilizations. Evidence suggests that the Philistines had extensive trade relations with Egypt, Cyprus, and the Aegean world. The city of Ashkelon, one of the most important Philistine centers, was a major port that facilitated trade with the Mediterranean world. Through these trade networks, the Philistines were able to acquire luxury goods such as wine, olive oil, and pottery from their neighbors, while exporting their own products, including grain and metalwork. This trade network was vital to the Philistine economy, providing them with both the resources they needed to maintain their military strength and the wealth that supported their cultural development. The Philistines' engagement in trade and their ability to assimilate new technologies were part of a broader strategy that allowed them to survive in a region marked by constant upheaval and warfare. The Philistines were not just warriors, they were also pragmatic and adaptable. They understood that in order to thrive in the Levant, they needed to engage with the cultures around them, while still maintaining their unique identity. The Philistine cities were not isolated fortresses, they were vibrant centers of culture, commerce, and innovation. However, the Philistines' adaptability also came with a cost. Their integration into the broader cultural and political fabric of the ancient Near East meant that they were constantly at the mercy of the larger empires that dominated the region. The rise of the Assyrian Empire in the 8th century BCE marked the beginning of a period of decline for the Philistines. The Assyrians, with their military might and imperial ambitions, began to encroach on Philistine territory, gradually absorbing the Philistine city-states into their empire. The Assyrian conquest of the Philistine cities was not a sudden event, it was a gradual process, marked by a series of military campaigns and political maneuvering. By the late 8th century BCE, the Philistines had been reduced to a tributary people, their cities subjected to Assyrian control. The fall of the Philistine cities was not only a political defeat but also a cultural one. The Assyrians, known for their brutality in conquest, imposed heavy tribute on the Philistines and deported large numbers of their people. The once thriving cities of Ashkelon, Ekron, and Gaza were devastated, their fortifications destroyed, and their populations displaced. The Philistine elite, once powerful rulers of independent city-states, were now subjects of a foreign empire. The Philistine way of life, shaped over centuries by migration, adaptation, and innovation, began to fade, absorbed into the larger Assyrian Empire. Yet, despite their fall, the Philistines left a lasting legacy in the ancient world. Their contributions to metalworking, agriculture, and trade had a profound impact on the cultures around them. The iron weapons and agricultural tools they developed influenced the societies that followed, including the Israelites, who adopted many Philistine innovations. The Philistines' religious practices also left an imprint on the region. The worship of Dagon, their chief god, spread to other parts of the Levant, and elements of Philistine religious rituals were absorbed into the religious practices of neighboring peoples. The story of the Philistines is ultimately one of adaptation and resilience. From their arrival in the Levant as part of the Sea Peoples to their eventual conquest by the Assyrians, the Philistines demonstrated a remarkable ability to survive and thrive in a volatile and ever-changing world. They were not just invaders but migrants and settlers who sought to create a new life in a foreign land. Their story, though ultimately one of decline, is also one of cultural exchange, technological innovation, and lasting influence. Even in their defeat, the Philistines left a legacy that shaped the history of the ancient Near East, a reminder of the enduring power of cultural exchange and adaptation in the face of adversity. As we continue to uncover new evidence about the Philistines through archaeology, their story becomes more than just a tale of conflict and conquest. It is a story of cultural synthesis, technological progress, and the resilience of a people who were able to leave a lasting mark on the ancient world. The Philistines, far from being mere biblical villains, were a dynamic and multifaceted civilization whose influence extended far beyond their military battles. Their legacy, though shaped by both their triumphs and their defeats, remains an essential part of the history of the ancient Near East. However, despite their undeniable impact, much of what we know about the Philistines has been filtered through the lens of their adversaries, especially the biblical accounts of their conflicts with the Israelites. These stories, though valuable, often portray the Philistines as little more than a foil for Israelite history, perpetuating the idea of a simplistic, binary struggle between good and evil. Yet, as we delve deeper into the archaeological record and reassess the historical context of the Philistines, we uncover a far more intricate narrative, one that reveals the Philistines as resilient, pragmatic, and above all, adaptive. The first question that arises in our exploration of the Philistines is one of origins. Where did they come from, and how did they come to settle along the southern coast of Canaan? The traditional narrative places them among the Sea Peoples, a mysterious coalition of groups who, during the 12th century BCE, migrated across the Mediterranean, ravaging and displacing established civilizations. Their movements coincided with the collapse of the Late Bronze Age, a time when the great powers of the Mediterranean, such as the Mycenaeans, the Hittites, and the Egyptians, began to fragment under external pressures and internal turmoil. The Sea Peoples, including the Philistines, are thought to have taken advantage of this instability, migrating to the Levant and establishing themselves along the coastal cities of Canaan. However, more recent archaeological discoveries suggest that the Philistines were not simply outsiders who arrived as conquerors. While it is true that their Aegean roots, evident in their distinctive pottery and material culture, set them apart from the indigenous Canaanites, their integration into the region was far more gradual and complex than a mere invasion. Rather than seeking to annihilate or replace the existing population, the Philistines adapted to their new environment, learning from the local cultures and eventually blending their own traditions with those of the Canaanites. This cultural hybridity is evident in many aspects of their society, from their art and architecture to their agricultural practices and religious beliefs. One of the key features of Philistine society was its urbanization. The Philistines built some of the most advanced cities in the ancient world, which were characterized by their impressive fortifications, urban planning, and sophisticated infrastructure. The cities of Ashkelon, Gaza, Ekron, and Ashdod were strategically located along the Mediterranean coast, providing easy access to trade routes and the abundant natural resources of the region. These cities were not simply military strongholds but vibrant, thriving centers of commerce, culture, and innovation. The Philistine ability to build cities that could withstand both military conflict and the test of time is a testament to their engineering skills and their understanding of the region's political dynamics. The Philistines' architectural achievements were not limited to their city walls and defensive structures. Inside their cities, they constructed large public buildings, temples, and marketplaces. These spaces were not only functional but also served as symbols of power and prestige. The cities were designed with a mix of Aegean and Canaanite influences, suggesting that the Philistines were not simply copying their neighbors, but were actively engaging with and adapting to the broader cultural context of the Levant. For example, the layout of their cities often included large, open spaces that facilitated trade and social interaction, something more characteristic of Aegean cities than of the typically more insular Canaanite settlements. While urbanization was a defining feature of Philistine society, it was their agricultural prowess that laid the foundation for their prosperity. The fertile coastal plain of Canaan, with its rich soil and favorable climate, was ideal for farming. The Philistines took full advantage of this, developing advanced agricultural techniques, including irrigation systems, that allowed them to cultivate a wide variety of crops. They were particularly known for their production of grain, olives, and wine, which became key commodities in the region's trade networks. Their ability to harness the land's potential allowed them to not only sustain their growing population but also to generate surplus wealth that could be invested in their military and political endeavors. However, the Philistines' relationship with agriculture went beyond mere economic necessity. It was deeply intertwined with their religious and cultural practices. The Philistine economy was not just driven by the pursuit of wealth but by a profound connection to the land and its fertility. This connection was reflected in their religious beliefs, particularly in their worship of Dagon, the god of grain and fertility. Dagon's prominence in the Philistine pantheon underscores the central role that agriculture played in their lives. In fact, many of the Philistine cities were home to grand temples dedicated to Dagon, where offerings of grain and other produce were made to ensure the continued fertility of the land. The role of religion in Philistine society is also evident in the significant archaeological finds that have been uncovered at various Philistine sites. Temples and religious shrines dedicated to various deities, including Dagon, Baal-zebub, and Asherah, reveal that the Philistines had a rich and diverse religious life. These religious spaces were often monumental in scale, serving not only as places of worship but as centers of community life and political power. The close connection between religion and politics in Philistine society can be seen in the way in which rulers often aligned themselves with particular deities to legitimize their authority. This relationship between religion and governance was a common feature of many ancient civilizations, and the Philistines were no exception. The Philistine religious system was not static, it evolved over time, influenced by the many cultures with which they interacted. Their religious practices show clear connections to both Canaanite and Aegean traditions, and elements of their rituals can be seen in the archaeological record. For instance, the use of figurines and the practice of animal sacrifice were common to both Canaanite and Philistine religious practices. Similarly, the Philistines adopted certain religious symbols and architectural styles from the Egyptians, with whom they had frequent interactions. The religious syncretism seen in Philistine culture extends to their art as well. The distinctive Philistine pottery, with its bold geometric patterns and decorative motifs, reflects a fusion of Aegean, Canaanite, and Egyptian influences. While the pottery style clearly reflects the Philistines' Aegean origins, its motifs and designs were informed by the broader cultural context of the Levant. This blending of styles and traditions is a testament to the Philistines' ability to integrate themselves into the complex web of ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern cultures. While much of the Philistines' cultural identity was shaped by their interactions with neighboring civilizations, their distinctiveness was also shaped by their military prowess. The Philistines were renowned for their warrior culture, and their ability to field large, well-equipped armies made them a formidable force in the ancient world. The Philistine military was based on a combination of infantry, chariots, and cavalry, and they were known for their use of iron weapons, which gave them a technological edge over their adversaries. The Philistine cities were often fortified with thick walls, and their armies were well equipped to defend these strongholds against outside invaders. The Bible frequently portrays the Philistines as a military threat to the Israelites, but their military might was not just a matter of conflict with neighboring peoples. It was also an expression of their need to defend their cities and their way of life. In the long arc of Philistine history, however, military dominance was not enough to secure their long-term survival. As external threats increased, particularly from the Assyrians and later the Babylonians, the once thriving Philistine cities began to crumble. The Philistines' inability to unify their cities and defend against these larger empires eventually led to their fall. The Assyrian Empire, in particular, played a pivotal role in the demise of Philistine independence, as they systematically conquered and destroyed the major Philistine cities by the 7th century BCE. The conquest of these cities marked the end of the Philistine civilization as a dominant force in the region. Despite their decline, the Philistines' legacy did not disappear. Archaeological evidence reveals that the Philistine people were not wiped out but rather absorbed into the larger empires that followed, particularly the Assyrians and later the Babylonians. As a result, many elements of Philistine culture, from their religious practices to their technological innovations, continued to influence the ancient Near East long after the fall of their cities. This legacy, though subtle, is a testament to the enduring power of cultural exchange, adaptation, and resilience in the face of adversity. The story of the Philistines, therefore, is not just a tale of war and conquest, but of cultural synthesis and survival. Their ability to adapt to new environments, their integration into the broader Mediterranean world, and their contributions to the technological, agricultural, and religious life of the ancient world all testify to their resilience as a people. In the end, the Philistines may have fallen as a political power, but their cultural influence endured, leaving behind a legacy that continues to shape our understanding of the ancient world. The Philistines, who have been both vilified and misunderstood throughout history, represent a fascinating case study of a civilization that was neither entirely foreign nor fully indigenous. The complexities of their existence and their enduring legacy challenge the simple binary of invaders versus natives often portrayed in historical narratives. While the Philistines are often associated with conflict and conquest, largely due to their portrayal in biblical texts, the truth of their history is far more nuanced. Their story is one of migration, adaptation, and resilience, driven by the dynamic interplay of geography, culture, and politics that shaped the ancient Near East. The migration of the Philistines to the southern Levant during the Late Bronze Age, likely around the 12th century BCE, was part of a larger movement of peoples collectively known as the Sea Peoples. This mysterious group of migrants and invaders, whose exact origins remain the subject of scholarly debate, swept across the eastern Mediterranean, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. While many historians and archaeologists believe that the Sea Peoples hailed from the Aegean region, there is also evidence suggesting that they could have had roots in the Anatolian Peninsula, or perhaps even as far afield as Cyprus or the central Mediterranean. The Philistines, as a component of this larger group, arrived in the coastal regions of Canaan, establishing their 5 principal cities, Ashkelon, Gaza, Ekron, Ashdod, and Gath. The notion of the Philistines as invaders is a simplification of a much more complicated reality. The archaeological record reveals that while the Philistines did indeed bring foreign elements with them, most notably in their material culture, such as pottery and architectural styles, their interactions with the indigenous Canaanite populations were not uniformly hostile. Rather than seeking to completely displace the local inhabitants, the Philistines adapted to their new environment, incorporating Canaanite practices, traditions, and religious beliefs into their own culture. This process of acculturation was not one-sided, it was a dynamic, two-way exchange in which both the Philistines and the Canaanites influenced each other. The cultural hybridity that resulted from this exchange is most evident in the Philistine material culture, which blends Aegean, Canaanite, and even Egyptian elements. The most iconic example of this fusion is the distinctive Philistine pottery, which combines the bold geometric patterns and dark burnished surfaces characteristic of Aegean pottery with the more rounded, stylized forms found in Canaanite ceramics. This synthesis of styles reflects the Philistines' ability to adapt to their new environment, while still maintaining elements of their original cultural identity. The presence of Aegean motifs and designs on Philistine pottery is not merely an indication of foreign influence, it also suggests that the Philistines were active participants in the broader Mediterranean world, engaging in trade, cultural exchange, and artistic innovation. The Philistine cities themselves were also a testament to the blending of cultures. Ashkelon, one of the largest and most prosperous of the Philistine cities, was strategically located along the Mediterranean coast, making it a key player in the trade networks that connected Egypt, Cyprus, and the Levant. The city's layout, with its broad streets, fortified walls, and impressive public buildings, reflected both Canaanite and Aegean architectural influences. Ashkelon, like the other Philistine cities, was a hub of commerce and culture, where merchants from different parts of the Mediterranean came to exchange goods and ideas. The Philistines were not isolated, rather, they were deeply embedded in the regional and global trade networks of the ancient world. The economic prosperity of the Philistines, driven in part by their control of key trade routes, enabled them to develop a strong and centralized political structure. Each of the 5 principal Philistine cities operated as an independent city-state, with its own ruler and political institutions. However, these city-states were bound together by a common cultural and religious identity. The Philistines shared a pantheon of gods, including Dagon, their primary deity, who was associated with fertility and agriculture. Temples dedicated to Dagon and other deities have been uncovered in various Philistine cities, revealing the importance of religion in the Philistine worldview. In addition to Dagon, the Philistines also worshipped Baal-zebub, the god of flies, and Asherah, the mother goddess, demonstrating their incorporation of local Canaanite religious practices into their own religious framework. The Philistines' military prowess was another key factor in their success. Known for their ironworking skills, the Philistines were among the first to extensively use iron for weapons, which gave them a significant advantage over their neighbors, including the Israelites. The Philistines' mastery of iron technology is highlighted in the biblical account of the conflict between David and Goliath, in which Goliath, the Philistine champion, is described as wearing armor made of bronze, while the Israelites were unable to arm themselves with iron weapons. The Philistines' superior military technology allowed them to dominate their neighbors for several centuries, and their fortified cities, with their imposing walls and gates, reflected their military strength and the strategic importance they placed on defense. However, the Philistines were not solely focused on war and conquest. Their success as a civilization was built on a complex network of trade, agriculture, and political organization. The fertile coastal plains of Canaan, combined with their advanced agricultural techniques, enabled the Philistines to produce a surplus of crops, including grains, olives, and wine, which were traded with neighboring civilizations. This agricultural abundance provided the foundation for the growth of their cities and the development of a thriving urban economy. In addition to agriculture, the Philistines were skilled metalworkers, producing iron tools and weapons that were highly valued throughout the ancient Near East. Their expertise in metallurgy played a crucial role in both their military success and their economic prosperity. Despite their many strengths, the Philistines were ultimately unable to withstand the pressures of larger empires, particularly the Assyrians. By the 8th century BCE, the Assyrian Empire had begun to expand its influence in the Levant, and the Philistine cities were caught in the crossfire. The Assyrians, with their well-organized and highly disciplined military forces, gradually conquered the Philistine cities, incorporating them into the Assyrian Empire. The fall of the Philistine cities marked the end of their independence, and by the 7th century BCE, the once powerful Philistine civilization had been absorbed into the larger imperial structures of the ancient Near East. However, the decline of the Philistine cities did not mark the end of their cultural influence. Many aspects of Philistine material culture, such as their distinctive pottery, continued to be produced and traded in the region, even after their political power had waned. The Philistine religious practices also left a lasting legacy, particularly the worship of Dagon, which persisted in the region long after the fall of the Philistine cities. The Philistines' contributions to metallurgy, agriculture, and urbanization continued to influence the civilizations that followed them, particularly the Israelites and the Phoenicians. The story of the Philistines is ultimately one of transformation and resilience. While they were eventually absorbed into the larger empires of the ancient Near East, their cultural legacy endured through the artifacts they left behind and the cultural practices they imparted to neighboring peoples. The Philistines, far from being a monolithic group of invaders, were a dynamic and adaptable people whose ability to assimilate, innovate, and trade allowed them to thrive for centuries in a region marked by political and cultural turbulence. Their story reminds us that civilizations are not defined solely by their military victories or their defeats, but by their capacity to adapt, survive, and leave a lasting mark on history. The Philistine civilization, although often overshadowed by its more famous neighbors in the ancient Near East, offers a remarkable glimpse into the complexities of ancient societies. Much of what we know about the Philistines has come through their interactions with the Israelites and other neighboring peoples, as well as through archaeological excavations in the coastal cities they once inhabited. The way they adapted to their environment and engaged with different cultures speaks volumes about their resourcefulness and resilience in the face of adversity. Far from being a simple narrative of conflict and decline, the history of the Philistines is one of transformation and persistence, one that reflects the broader patterns of migration, cultural exchange, and survival that characterized the ancient world. To understand the depth of the Philistine civilization, it is crucial to first recognize the complexity of their origins. The commonly held view that the Philistines were simply invaders from the Aegean region has been challenged by recent archaeological and historical research. While it is clear that the Philistines brought with them certain Aegean cultural traits, such as distinctive pottery styles, architectural techniques, and metalworking practices, their eventual integration into the region was much more nuanced. They were not a single homogeneous group but rather a confederation of peoples who, over time, blended with the indigenous Canaanites. As a result, the Philistine identity emerged from a hybridization of different cultures, creating a society that was both foreign and familiar, one that adapted to its surroundings while also influencing the region around it. One of the most notable aspects of the Philistine cultural adaptation was their mastery of urbanization. The Philistines built some of the most advanced cities in the ancient Near East, cities that were strategically located along the Mediterranean coast and became key centers of trade and commerce. Ashkelon, Ekron, Gaza, and Ashdod, each of these cities was fortified, with imposing walls and sophisticated architectural designs. The Philistine cities were not just military outposts or fortified bastions, they were vibrant hubs of economic activity, cultural exchange, and innovation. The cities were built to withstand both military sieges and the ravages of time, reflecting the Philistines' understanding of the strategic importance of their location. The use of large stone blocks in the construction of their fortifications, along with their advanced water management systems, speaks to a civilization that valued both defense and sustainability. The Philistine economy was deeply tied to their geographic location, and their cities flourished due to their control over vital trade routes. Situated along the Mediterranean coast, the Philistines had access to both land and sea trade, connecting them to the broader Mediterranean world. They traded not only with Egypt but also with other civilizations in the Aegean, Anatolia, and the Levant. The Philistines were skilled merchants, and their cities served as key points in the vast network of trade that stretched from the Nile to the Aegean Sea. In addition to their trade in goods like grain, olive oil, wine, and textiles, the Philistines also became known for their production of iron. Their ability to forge iron weapons and tools set them apart from many of their neighbors, giving them a technological advantage that was crucial in both their military engagements and their everyday lives. While their material culture suggests a people who were highly engaged in the global trade networks of the time, it also points to their ability to maintain and transform their identity within the context of their new home. The Philistines were not just passive recipients of foreign influences, they actively adapted elements of neighboring cultures to suit their own needs. The distinctive Philistine pottery, for example, is a blend of Aegean and Canaanite styles, reflecting the Philistines' ability to integrate into the local cultural landscape while also preserving elements of their Aegean origins. Similarly, their religious practices were a synthesis of their own beliefs and those of the surrounding peoples. The worship of Dagon, for instance, was a central part of Philistine religious life, but their religious rituals also incorporated elements from the Canaanite pantheon, as well as Egyptian and Mesopotamian influences. This syncretism was a defining feature of Philistine society, one that allowed them to maintain a unique cultural identity while also absorbing aspects of the cultures around them. The Philistine military, built upon the advantages provided by their ironworking expertise, played a significant role in the establishment and maintenance of their cities. Their army was well organized and equipped with superior weaponry, including iron swords, spears, and chariots. This technological edge allowed the Philistines to become one of the most formidable military forces in the region, frequently engaging in conflicts with the Israelites, Egyptians, and other neighboring civilizations. The biblical narrative, which often portrays the Philistines as a constant threat to the Israelites, reflects the military prowess of the Philistine city-states. Yet, the Philistine military was not solely focused on conquest, it was also instrumental in the defense of their cities and the protection of their trade routes. The fortifications of the Philistine cities were among the most advanced of their time, and the military might of the Philistines was essential to maintaining their independence in a region constantly threatened by larger empires. Despite their military strength, however, the Philistines were not immune to the geopolitical forces that shaped the ancient world. The rise of the Assyrian Empire in the 8th century BCE marked the beginning of a long period of decline for the Philistine city-states. The Assyrians, with their advanced military techniques and ruthless imperial strategies, gradually began to conquer the Philistine cities one by one. By the time of the Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser III, in the mid-8th century BCE, the Philistines were forced into submission, becoming vassals of the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians demanded tribute from the Philistine cities, weakening their political and economic power. Over the next few centuries, the Philistine cities were repeatedly attacked, sacked, and eventually absorbed into the larger Assyrian, Babylonian, and Persian empires. The fall of the Philistine cities, while a tragic moment in their history, does not mark the complete disappearance of their cultural influence. Although their political power was lost, the material culture of the Philistines continued to leave a mark on the region. Archaeological evidence from later periods shows that elements of Philistine pottery, religious practices, and even military techniques persisted long after the fall of their cities. The Philistine god Dagon, for example, continued to be worshipped by neighboring peoples, and their distinctive pottery styles were adopted by other cultures in the Levant. Even the Philistines' ironworking expertise left a lasting legacy, influencing the development of metallurgy in the ancient world. In many ways, the story of the Philistines is a story of resilience in the face of adversity. While their cities were destroyed and their political independence lost, their cultural and technological innovations lived on, shaping the civilizations that followed. The Philistines' ability to adapt to new environments, to merge their Aegean origins with Canaanite traditions, and to thrive in the competitive and ever-changing landscape of the ancient Near East speaks to the remarkable tenacity of their civilization. In the end, the Philistines were not simply a people defined by their conflicts with the Israelites or their eventual conquest by the Assyrians. They were a dynamic and resourceful civilization, whose legacy is still felt today in the artifacts they left behind and the cultural practices they passed on to future generations. The story of the Philistines, therefore, serves as a reminder of the complexities of cultural identity and survival. Their ability to adapt to changing circumstances, to absorb influences from the world around them, and to leave a lasting impact on the region is a testament to the enduring power of human resilience. The Philistines may have been defeated as a political entity, but their influence can still be seen in the cultural and historical fabric of the ancient Near East. Their civilization, in all its richness and complexity, remains an essential part of the history of the Mediterranean world. The Philistine civilization, while often painted as antagonists in biblical accounts, offers a far more intricate narrative when examined through the lens of archaeology and historical analysis. Their story, stretching over several centuries, is one of adaptation, resilience, and cultural interaction, shaped by both external forces and internal developments. For much of ancient history, the Philistines were defined by their interactions with their neighbors, especially the Israelites. The biblical tales of Samson, Goliath, and other famous figures perpetuated the image of the Philistines as an invincible military force, clashing repeatedly with the Israelites. However, as modern scholars and archaeologists continue to uncover more about the Philistines, we realize that their history was far more complex, layered with economic innovation, religious evolution, and the gradual integration of a myriad of cultural influences. This section delves deeper into the nature of Philistine society, offering a more holistic view of their contributions to the ancient world, their decline, and their lasting legacy. The story of the Philistines cannot be separated from their origins. These migrants, who emerged in the Levant as part of the Sea Peoples, brought with them not only new weapons and technologies but also a wealth of cultural traditions that would deeply influence the region. The exact origins of the Sea Peoples, to which the Philistines belonged, remain a subject of scholarly debate. Some historians suggest that the Sea Peoples originated in the Aegean or Anatolia, while others have proposed that they were part of a broader movement of peoples displaced by the collapse of Bronze Age civilizations across the Mediterranean. The Philistines, as part of this enigmatic group, arrived on the southern coast of Canaan during the tumultuous period of the Late Bronze Age, around the 12th century BCE. This marked the beginning of their transformation from displaced migrants to a settled and influential society. As they established themselves in the Levant, the Philistines set about integrating into the cultural and economic fabric of the region. Their initial settlement along the coastal plain, particularly in cities such as Gaza, Ashkelon, Ekron, and Ashdod, was not a simple case of conquest, but rather a slow and strategic settlement. While the Philistines brought with them elements of Aegean material culture, such as their distinctive pottery, architectural styles, and ironworking techniques, they also adapted to the local Canaanite environment. The result was a hybrid civilization that blended foreign traditions with indigenous practices. The Philistines were not the invaders that they are often portrayed as, but a people in the process of building a new identity, a fusion of their Aegean heritage and the rich cultural landscape of Canaan. One of the most significant aspects of this hybridization was the development of Philistine cities. These urban centers, unlike the more isolated villages of the Canaanites, were complex, fortified cities that became focal points of commerce, religion, and politics. The city of Ashkelon, for instance, was not only a major port, but it also became a cultural and religious center. The Philistines built massive walls to protect their cities, showing an understanding of the need for defense in a region constantly at war. Their walls were some of the most sophisticated in the ancient world, built with large stone blocks and reinforced with towers and gates. The city layouts themselves were indicative of their Aegean influence, featuring wide streets and distinct residential areas that allowed for both defense and urban expansion. Their mastery of metallurgy was another key factor in the Philistines' success. The Philistines were among the first to make extensive use of iron, which gave them a distinct military advantage. The transition from bronze to iron weaponry and tools marked a turning point in the ancient world, and the Philistines were early adopters of this technology. The Bible records instances in which the Israelites, lacking iron weapons, were forced to rely on less effective bronze armaments, while the Philistines, with their superior iron weapons, dominated the battlefield. This technological leap was crucial for the Philistines, not only in terms of military dominance but also in their agricultural and economic sectors. Iron tools allowed for the improvement of farming techniques, facilitating the cultivation of the rich land along the coastal plain. The Philistines were able to produce surplus grain, olives, and wine, which were traded across the Mediterranean, further enriching their cities. However, the Philistine civilization was not simply about military might or economic prosperity. It was also defined by its religious practices. Religion played a central role in Philistine society, both as a unifying force and as a means of legitimatizing political power. The Philistines worshipped a pantheon of gods, the most important of whom was Dagon, a deity associated with grain and fertility. The worship of Dagon was a key element of Philistine identity, and large temples dedicated to this god were built in cities such as Ashdod and Ekron. These temples were not just places of worship but also symbols of political power, as the rulers of these cities often aligned themselves with Dagon to justify their authority. The prominence of Dagon in the Philistine religious system illustrates the deep connection between religion and politics, a feature common to many ancient civilizations. The Philistines also adopted elements from neighboring cultures in their religious practices. They worshipped other gods, including Baal-zebub, the god of flies, and Asherah, a goddess associated with fertility and the earth. These deities were common to the Canaanite pantheon, and their inclusion in the Philistine religious system shows the cultural fluidity of the Philistine society. This syncretism is particularly evident in the temples and altars discovered at Philistine sites, which often combine architectural elements from both Aegean and Canaanite traditions. The Philistine religious practices, like much of their culture, were an amalgamation of foreign influences and local traditions, reflecting their adaptability and desire to assimilate into the surrounding world while maintaining a distinct identity. Despite their military and cultural successes, the Philistine cities were not immune to the geopolitical forces of the ancient world. By the 8th century BCE, the rise of the Assyrian Empire began to reshape the political landscape of the Levant. The Assyrians, known for their military efficiency and brutal conquest tactics, gradually encroached upon Philistine territory. In the face of the Assyrian threat, the Philistine city-states were forced into submission. The once powerful city of Ashkelon, for example, fell to the Assyrians in 711 BCE, and the other Philistine cities were gradually absorbed into the Assyrian Empire. The Philistine kings, once independent rulers of prosperous cities, became vassals to the Assyrian monarchs. The fall of the Philistine cities marked the end of their political independence, but it did not signal the disappearance of their culture. Much of what we know about the Philistines has been preserved in the archaeological record, and their influence can still be traced in the religious, cultural, and technological practices of the ancient Near East. The Assyrian conquest, while devastating, did not erase the Philistine identity. The Philistines were assimilated into the broader Assyrian and later Babylonian empires, and their cultural traits continued to influence the region in subtle ways. Elements of Philistine pottery, religious rituals, and metalworking techniques persisted long after the fall of their cities, adopted by neighboring cultures and incorporated into the regional traditions of the ancient Mediterranean. In the end, the Philistine civilization's decline was not an abrupt or complete disappearance but a gradual absorption into the larger geopolitical structures of the ancient world. Their cities were destroyed, their political power was shattered, but their legacy endured. The Philistines' contributions to metallurgy, agriculture, and urban development left a lasting imprint on the civilizations that followed. They were not just invaders or enemies to be defeated, they were a dynamic people who, through their resilience and adaptability, shaped the history of the ancient Near East. Their story is one of transformation, of migration, settlement, cultural exchange, and eventual integration into the vast empires that dominated the Mediterranean world. And through it all, the Philistines left behind a civilization that was more than just a footnote in history, but a key player in the story of human development in the ancient world.